The autumn wind carried the scent of decay through the Ashworth estate, rustling through skeletal branches that clawed at a sky the color of old pewter, and in the withered remains of what had once been her mother's prized garden, Eleanor Ashworth knelt in the cold earth, her fingers working uselessly at soil that would yield nothing more this season. She was 22 years old, and she had learned long ago that beauty was a temporary gift, that all things of worth eventually crumbled the roses her mother had planted with such hope. The stone walls of the manor house now cracked and stained with neglect, the family name that had once commanded respect throughout the county. Her dress was patched at the elbows, a fact she had ceased to feel shame about, for there were so few servants left to notice, and those who remained did so out of loyalty rather than wages, which her father had not paid in months. Inside the house, Lord Ashworth sat in his study, surrounded by empty decanters and letters bearing wax seals he no longer had the courage to break, a man hollowed out by his own appetites, gambling away first his fortune, then his dignity, and now, it seemed, his daughter's future. Eleanor heard the carriage before she saw it, the heavy rumble of wheels on the overgrown drive, the sharp clip of horses far finer than any they could afford, and she rose to her feet, brushing dirt from her skirts with hands that had begun, inexplicably, to tremble. The carriage was black, impossibly black, as though it had been carved from a moonless night, and the crest upon its door was one she recognized from whispered conversations and newspaper accounts, the raven in flight, the crossed swords beneath, the Duke of Ravenswood. The solicitor who emerged was a thin man with spectacles and no discernible compassion in his watery eyes, and he did not ask to see her father, but rather handed Eleanor an envelope with her name written upon it in precise, emotionless script. She read the terms twice, 3 times, her vision blurring not with tears, but with the particular numbness that comes when the mind refuses to accept what the eyes clearly see. Marriage to His Grace, Sebastian Blackwood, Duke of Ravenswood, or her father would face debtor's prison. Their remaining staff turned out, the estate seized and sold. A transaction, clean and simple. Her life reduced to a line item in a ledger. "You have 1 week to prepare," the solicitor said, and if he noticed the way her hands shook, he did not acknowledge it. Eleanor stood in the dying garden long after the carriage had departed, watching the dust settle back onto the drive, and she thought of all the words she had heard spoken of the Duke in drawing rooms and servants' quarters alike. Cold, they called him, ruthless, heartless, a man carved from winter itself who had built his fortune on the misery of others. She pressed her palm against her chest, feeling the rapid flutter of her heart like a bird trapped against glass, and she understood with terrible clarity that she had been sold, that her father had wagered her as carelessly as he had wagered everything else, and that whatever life awaited her in that black carriage's wake would require every ounce of strength she possessed simply to survive. The days that followed the solicitor's visit passed in a strange twilight of preparation and dread, and Eleanor found herself moving through the familiar rooms of Ashworth Manor as though she were already a ghost, already departed from this life she had known, and dreading the one that awaited her. The servants spoke in hushed tones when she passed, their eyes filled with a pity she could not bear to acknowledge, and it was from their whispered conversations half overheard through doorways, murmured in the kitchen when they thought her occupied elsewhere, that she began to piece together the portrait of the man she was to marry. Sebastian Blackwood, Duke of Ravenswood, was spoken of the way one might speak of a winter that refused to end, with a resignation tinged by fear and something almost like awe. Cook had a cousin who worked in a great house near his estate, and she reported that the Duke had not smiled in 7 years, that his staff moved through Ravenswood Hall like shadows, terrified of drawing his attention or his ire. The stable boy claimed his uncle had once done business with the Duke's agents and had emerged from the negotiation pale and shaken, stripped of profit and dignity alike. They said he was brilliant, ruthless, that he had taken a modest inheritance and transformed it into a fortune vast enough to buy kingdoms, and that he had done so by crushing anyone foolish enough to stand in his way. But it was the story of his first betrothed that haunted Eleanor most persistently, turning over and over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by troubled waters. Lady Catherine Ashford, the whispers said, a beauty from one of the finest families in England, had been engaged to the Duke when they were both young, and she had fled rather than marry him, vanished in the night a mere week before the wedding, preferring disgrace and exile to a life as his wife. What manner of man, Eleanor wondered, could inspire such desperate flight? She sought answers in every source available to her, poring over old society pages in her father's study, reading accounts of his business dealings in financial journals yellowed with age, but every word only confirmed what she already feared. The Duke of Ravenswood was a man of ice and iron, incapable of warmth, interested only in acquisition and control. On the 5th evening, her father came to her sitting room, his eyes red-rimmed with tears she suspected owed more to wine than remorse, and he stood before her wringing his hands like a child caught in wrongdoing. "Eleanor, my dear," he began, his voice cracking, "you must know, I never thought it would come to this," and she listened to his hollow apologies, to his promises that he would find another way, knowing even as he spoke that there was no other way, that he had spent years gambling away every other way, and that this arrangement was not a tragedy that had befallen them, but rather the inevitable conclusion of his choices. She did not rage at him, though rage burned cold and quiet beneath her ribs. She did not weep, though grief sat heavy in her throat like a stone she could not swallow. Instead, when his stammering justifications finally exhausted themselves, she simply said, "I will survive this, Father, as I have survived everything else you have cost us." And the words were not bitter but merely true, spoken with the calm certainty of a woman who had long ago learned that survival required something harder than hope. It required will, and will was the one thing she possessed that could not be gambled away or sold to pay another's debts. The morning of Eleanor's wedding dawned grey and cheerless, the sky hanging low over the countryside like a burial shroud, and she dressed in her mother's wedding gown, with fingers that felt as though they belonged to someone else, some distant woman going through motions that had lost all meaning. The dress had yellowed with age, its once pristine silk now the colour of old bone, and the lace at the sleeves had grown brittle, threatening to crumble at the slightest touch. Yet Eleanor wore it as armour, as a reminder that she came from a line of women who had faced their fates with dignity, even when those fates were not of their choosing. The chapel was small and cold, a stone building on the edge of the Ravenswood estate that seemed to have been forgotten by time and warmth alike, and the few witnesses present servants required for legality, a solicitor with his ledgers, her father swaying slightly and smelling of last night's whiskey, sat in pews that echoed with emptiness. Eleanor walked the aisle alone, for there was no one to give her away who had not already done so, and she kept her eyes fixed on the altar, where 2 candles guttered in an unfelt draught, their flames struggling against the pervasive chill. She heard him before she saw him, the measured footfall of expensive boots on ancient stone, and when she finally raised her gaze to meet her bridegroom, her breath caught in her throat like a bird striking glass. Sebastian Blackwood, Duke of Ravenswood, was tall and severe, his dark hair swept back from a face that seemed carved from marble by an artist who understood beauty but had forgotten tenderness, and his eyes, God, his eyes were the grey of winter storms over frozen seas, beautiful and terrible and utterly devoid of warmth. He was devastating in his black morning coat, every line of his figure speaking of power carefully contained, and Eleanor understood in that moment why women whispered his name with fear, why his first betrothed had supposedly fled rather than stand where Eleanor now stood. The ceremony passed in a blur of rote words and hollow promises, the minister's voice droning through vows that spoke of love and honour, while the participants knew this was merely commerce dressed in sacrament, and when Sebastian spoke his promises, his voice was flat, uninflected, as though he were reading terms from a contract rather than binding himself to another human soul. He did not look at her, not once, not when he slid the cold band of gold onto her finger, not when the minister pronounced them wed, not when it was done and she was no longer Eleanor Ashworth but the Duchess of Ravenswood, a title that fit her like a stranger's coat. The carriage ride to Ravenswood Hall passed in absolute silence, the only sounds the rhythm of hooves on packed earth and the creak of fine leather, and Eleanor sat across from her new husband, studying his profile in the grey light, filtering through rain-spattered windows, the sharp line of his jaw, the tension visible in the cords of his neck, the way his gloved hands rested on his thighs with a stillness that seemed less like calm than like a predator conserving energy. She wondered what thoughts moved behind those storm-cloud eyes, what memories or regrets or calculations occupied a mind reputed to be brilliant in its ruthlessness, and she found herself searching for any crack in his facade, any hint of the man beneath the marble. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, as though he sensed her scrutiny, and still he did not turn, did not acknowledge her presence, and Eleanor realized with a strange mixture of despair and determination that she had married a fortress, a man who had built walls so high and thick that perhaps even he had forgotten what lay buried within them. Ravenswood Hall rose from the mist like something born of nightmares and dark fairy tales, its Gothic spires clawing at the leaden sky, its countless windows staring down at the approaching carriage like eyes that had witnessed centuries of secrets and sorrows. Eleanor pressed her face closer to the rain-streaked glass, her breath fogging the cold pain as she took in the vast edifice that was to be her prison. No, she corrected herself. Her home, though the word felt like a lie on her tongue. The stone was black with age, the architecture a symphony of pointed arches and flying buttresses, beautiful in the way that storms were beautiful, in the way that wolves were beautiful, a beauty that demanded respect and inspired fear in equal measure. The carriage rolled to a stop before massive oak doors, and Sebastian descended without a word, without a backward glance, disappearing into the house as though she were merely luggage to be collected by the staff rather than a bride to be welcomed. It was a woman of perhaps 50 who greeted Eleanor at the threshold, her silver hair pulled back severely from a face that was not unkind, merely guarded, and she introduced herself as Mrs. Thornton, the housekeeper, before leading Eleanor through corridors that seemed to stretch into infinity, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors and suits of armor standing sentinel in shadowed alcoves. "These will be your chambers, Your Grace," Mrs. Thornton said, and the title struck Eleanor like a physical blow, a reminder of what she had become, and she stepped into rooms that were undeniably magnificent, high ceilings painted with faded celestial scenes, furniture of dark wood and rich burgundy velvet, a bed large enough to drown in, windows that overlooked grounds disappearing into fog, yet for all their grandeur, they felt less like a sanctuary than a gilded cage, beautiful bars designed to remind her of her captivity. She noted with a hollow pang that these chambers were in the west wing, while Mrs. Thornton had mentioned the Duke's apartments lay in the east, and the distance between them seemed less a matter of architecture than of intention, a declaration of separation built into the very bones of the house. She was examining a porcelain vase, wondering if anything in this place had ever been touched by warmth or joy, when the door opened without warning, and Sebastian stood on the threshold, still in his wedding clothes, still wearing that mask of impenetrable ice. "I trust the rooms are satisfactory," he said, and it was not a question but a statement, delivered in a tone that made clear he expected no response. He stepped inside, and though he did not approach her, his presence seemed to fill the space, to consume the air until Eleanor felt she had to fight for each breath, and he laid out the terms of their arrangement with the same flat efficiency she imagined he brought to business. Negotiations, she would have access to household accounts, she might redecorate if she wished, the servants would attend to her every need. She was free to come and go as she pleased within the bounds of propriety. "But I will not pretend sentiment where none exists," he concluded, his grey eyes meeting hers for the first time since the chapel, and there was something almost like a warning in their depths. "This is a business arrangement, nothing more. You will have everything you require except my time or my affection, for I have neither to give." The words should have wounded her, perhaps were designed to wound her, but Eleanor had spent too many years learning to survive her father's failures to crumble now, and she met his gaze with a steadiness that surprised them both. "Then I shall treat it as such, Your Grace," she replied, and her voice did not waver, did not betray the tempest of fear and grief and strange, defiant pride churning within her chest. Something flickered in his eyes, then a crack in the marble. Gone so quickly she might have imagined it, and for the space of a heartbeat, he looked at her as though truly seeing her for the first time, this woman he had purchased, this stranger who refused to cower before him. Then the mask descended once more, and he turned and left without another word, and Eleanor stood alone in her beautiful prison, wondering what manner of battle she had just begun. The weeks that followed settled into a pattern of exquisite avoidance, a choreography of absence so precise it might have been rehearsed, and Eleanor learned the rhythms of Ravenswood Hall, as one learns the habits of a sleeping beast, which corridors Sebastian traversed at which hours, which rooms he claimed as his domain, which spaces she might occupy without risk of encounter. She took her meals alone in the small breakfast room, overlooking the west gardens, the chair across from her perpetually empty, the silence broken only by the soft footfall of servants who moved through the house like shadows, efficient and nearly invisible. Sebastian, she gathered from the whispered exchanges she was not meant to overhear, spent his days locked in his study with ledgers and correspondence, emerging only for solitary rides across the moorland or meetings with his steward that lasted long into candlelit evenings, and she began to wonder if he slept at all, or if he simply existed in that dark panelled room, sustained by whatever cold fuel powered a heart so determined to feel nothing. The servants treated her with a cautious courtesy that fell somewhere between deference and pity, their eyes sliding away when she attempted conversation, their answers to her questions polite but brief, as though they had been warned against familiarity, or perhaps simply did not know what to make of this purchased duchess who wandered their halls with dirt beneath her fingernails and an expression that refused to settle into either misery or resignation. It was during her explorations of the estate those long afternoons, when the walls of her gilded chambers pressed too close and she needed to move, to breathe, to remind herself that she still possessed a body and a will, that Eleanor discovered the bones of what had once been magnificent gardens, now surrendered to neglect and wild growth, paths choked with weeds, fountains dry and silent, rose bushes gone feral, and thorned like creatures protecting themselves from further abandonment. The east wing drew her curiosity most persistently, its windows dark, its doors locked against her tentative testing, and when she inquired about it, Mrs. Thornton's face performed a complicated arrangement of emotions before settling into careful neutrality, saying only that those rooms had been closed for many years, and the Duke preferred they remain so. But it was a small courtyard she found behind the kitchens that captured Eleanor's heart, forgotten, overgrown, yet somehow hopeful in its very ruin, and she began to spend her mornings there, on her knees in the cold soil, clearing debris, coaxing dormant plants back toward the light, her hands working the earth as they had worked her mother's garden at Ashworth, as they had worked her own small plot before everything was sold and lost and traded away. She did not know that Sebastian watched her from his study window, did not see him standing motionless behind the glass each morning as she knelt in the dirt like a penitent or a prayer, did not notice how his hand sometimes rose toward the pane as though he might reach through it, did not observe the way his brow furrowed with something that looked almost like confusion, almost like hunger, before he turned away and buried himself once more in the safety of numbers and contracts and the cold comfort of a life without risk. The library revealed itself to Eleanor on an evening when sleep had become an impossibility, when the walls of her chamber seemed to press inward with each passing hour, and the silence of the house rang louder than any scream, and she had taken to wandering the corridors in her dressing gown with a candle clutched in trembling fingers, telling herself she was merely exploring, merely learning the geography of her cage, until she pushed open a door she had not yet tried, and found herself standing at the threshold of a cathedral built for books. The room soared upward through 2 full stories, its walls lined floor to ceiling with volumes bound in leather of every hue, burgundy and forest green, midnight blue and aged brown, and rolling ladders stood ready to carry seekers to the highest shelves, and the scent that greeted her was one she had loved since childhood, that particular perfume of old paper and leather and accumulated wisdom that had always meant safety, had always meant escape. She stepped inside as though entering holy ground, her candle casting dancing shadows across gilded spines, and she was so absorbed in reading titles, in trailing her fingers across centuries of collected thought, that she did not notice the figure in the wing-back chair until a voice emerged from the darkness like a blade unsheathed. "Does the Duchess make a habit of wandering the halls at midnight?" Sebastian sat in shadow beyond the reach of her small flame, but she could see the glint of crystal in his hand, could smell the sharp sweetness of brandy cutting through the dusty air, and his voice carried that particular flatness she had come to recognize as his armor, his way of keeping the world at the distance he deemed safe. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, but she had learned long ago that predators were drawn to fear, that the only way to survive certain encounters was to refuse the role of prey, and so she lifted her chin and let her voice emerge, steady and clear. "I couldn't sleep," she said simply, then added with a boldness that surprised even herself, "It seems neither could you, Your Grace." The silence that followed was a living thing, charged and dangerous, and she watched him rise from the chair and step into the candlelight, and she saw that his cravat was loosened, his hair disordered, as though he had run his hands through it repeatedly, and there was something almost human in his dishevelment, something that made him less statue and more man. "You have discovered my sanctuary," he said, gesturing to the towering shelves. "I trust you will not make a habit of intruding upon it." "I was not aware that books could be claimed exclusively," Eleanor replied, and something flickered across his features, surprise, perhaps, at finding wit where he had expected timidity. They spoke then, briefly, carefully, circling each other with words as though testing the boundaries of a newly discovered territory, and Eleanor found that beneath the ice there lurked a mind of formidable depth, that he knew literature and philosophy and history as intimately as he knew ledgers, and she caught herself leaning toward him, drawn by the gravitational pull of unexpected kinship. For one moment, one treacherous, precious moment, the corner of his mouth twitched upward, the ghost of a smile haunting lips that had forgotten the expression, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, felt warmth bloom in a place she had thought frozen. Then he caught himself, and the mask descended, and he turned away with a muttered dismissal, but not before Eleanor glimpsed the book he had abandoned on the side table, its pages open to verses she recognized, poetry of loss, of grief, of love that persisted beyond the grave, and she understood, with sudden terrible clarity, that the Duke of Ravenswood was not cold at all, but rather burning with a fire so painful he had chosen to bury it beneath permafrost, and she wondered, as she retreated to her chambers with his words echoing in her ears, whether any warmth could ever reach deep enough to touch those hidden flames. The coincidences began to accumulate like snowflakes before a storm, each one seemingly insignificant, easily dismissed, yet together forming a pattern that Eleanor could not quite bring herself to name, and she found herself wondering whether the Duke of Ravenswood had somehow memorized her movements, or whether fate itself had grown weary of their careful avoidance and decided to intervene with increasing frequency and decreasing subtlety. She would enter the breakfast room to find him already seated, his newspaper raised like a fortification, though she noticed he never seemed to turn its pages, and he would offer some terse comment about the weather or the quality of the coffee before retreating to his study, leaving her with the strange sensation of having been both acknowledged and avoided in the same breath. She would walk the garden paths she had begun to clear of their choking weeds, and he would appear on horseback, claiming he was merely inspecting the grounds, though his horse seemed perpetually reluctant to move beyond the boundary of wherever she happened to be working, and he would criticize her plans with the particular intensity of someone who cared, far more than he wished, to reveal the roses were planted too close together, he declared. They would compete for sunlight. The lavender would never survive the northern exposure. Had she considered drainage, or did she intend to create a swamp rather than a garden? And Eleanor would listen to his pronouncements with an expression of polite attention that masked her growing amusement, would thank him for his expertise with words that bordered on insolence, and would continue precisely as she had planned, only to discover 3 days later that a cart had arrived, bearing a delivery of rare rose bushes, varieties she had only read about in her mother's gardening journals, with no note attached and no explanation offered by the tight-lipped servants who unloaded them with knowing glances they thought she did not see. It was Mrs. Thornton who suggested, with the careful neutrality of a woman who had served the Blackwood family for 3 decades, that the Duchess might wish to join the Duke for dinner, as he had mentioned quite casually. The housekeeper assured her that the dining room felt rather large for one person, and Eleanor accepted with a composure that belied the sudden racing of her heart, and she dressed that evening with more care than she had shown since arriving at Ravenswood, and she descended to find Sebastian already waiting, standing by the fireplace in evening clothes that made him look like a portrait of aristocratic severity, and they sat at opposite ends of a table designed for 20 and attempted conversation across an expanse of polished mahogany and gleaming silver. Their words stilted but not hostile, their silences less frozen than before, until Eleanor asked about the locked east wing and watched his face transform in an instant from cautious openness to absolute closure, saw the shutters descend behind his winter storm eyes, heard his voice flatten into the cold monotone she remembered from their wedding day, as he said only, "Those rooms belong to my mother, and they will remain as she left them." And Eleanor understood then that whatever thaw had begun between them, There remained vast territories of grief he would not permit her to enter, wounds so deep that even the tentative warmth they had begun to build could not yet reach them. And she wondered, as she lay sleepless that night, whether patience alone could ever melt a glacier, or whether some sorrows were simply too ancient, too frozen, too fiercely guarded to ever yield to spring. The storm announced itself hours before it arrived, the sky darkening to the color of bruised plums by mid-afternoon, the air growing thick and electric with the promise of violence, and Eleanor watched from her chamber window as the first winds began to tear at the trees, sending leaves spiraling upward like souls fleeing some approaching doom, and she felt a strange kinship with the gathering tempest, as though the heavens had decided to externalize the turmoil that had lived within her since the night in the library, since she had glimpsed the poetry of grief on Sebastian's abandoned pages and understood that the cold Duke was merely a man who had learned to freeze rather than feel. By evening the storm had become a living thing, a beast of wind and water that hurled itself against Ravenswood Hall, with a fury that rattled the ancient windows and sent the servants scurrying to secure shutters and check for leaks, and the electricity had failed within the first hour, plunging the house into a darkness broken only by candlelight and the brilliant, terrifying flashes of lightning that illuminated the world in stark white photographs of chaos. Eleanor found she could not stay in her chambers, could not bear the isolation of those elegant rooms while the world outside tore itself apart, and she took up a candelabra and wandered the corridors with no particular destination in mind, drawn by some instinct she could not name toward the conservatory at the rear of the house. That glass-walled room where tropical plants grew in defiance of the English climate, and it was there that she found Sebastian standing alone, before the wall of windows, his silhouette black against the lightning-fractured sky, his hands clasped behind his back, in that posture she had come to recognize as his stance of contemplation, of wrestling with thoughts too heavy for ordinary bearing. She meant to retreat, to grant him the privacy he so clearly craved. But the lightning chose that moment to split the sky directly overhead, and the thunder that followed was so immediate, so tremendous, that she gasped aloud, and he turned, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other across the darkness, while the storm raged beyond the glass like a symphony of destruction. "My mother loved storms," he said finally, and his voice was strange, stripped of its usual armor, almost wondering, as though the words had emerged without his permission, and Eleanor moved closer without conscious decision, drawn by the vulnerability she heard beneath the simple statement. She would bring me here as a child, wrap us both in blankets, and we would watch together until I fell asleep, and she would tell me that storms were the sky's way of cleaning itself, of washing away everything old and dead to make room for new growth. Eleanor set down her candelabra and came to stand beside him, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, and she said softly, "My mother died when I was 12, and for years afterward I could not bear the smell of roses because she had grown them, had filled our home with them, and their perfume became the perfume of loss." And she did not know why she was telling him this, only that the darkness and the storm had created a space outside of ordinary time, a confessional where truths could be spoken without consequence. They stood together in silence then, watching lightning paint the gardens in silver and shadow, and when Sebastian finally spoke again, his voice was barely audible above the wind. "You are not what I expected," and Eleanor felt her heart stutter in her chest, felt something shift between them like tectonic plates finding new alignment, and she answered with equal quietness, "Neither are you." And the storm raged on around them, but within the glass walls of the conservatory, something fragile and unprecedented had begun to take root, something that felt dangerously like understanding, like recognition, like the first tender shoots of spring pushing through frozen earth. The village of Thornwick lay 3 miles from Ravenswood Hall, a modest collection of stone cottages and thatched roofs clustered around a single church, whose spire reached toward heaven with the desperate optimism of those who had little else to reach for, and Eleanor had discovered its existence through the kitchen maids, who spoke of their families there, of brothers who worked the Duke's tenant farms, and mothers who took in washing to supplement incomes that never quite stretched far enough, and something in their voices, a particular note of resignation, of acceptance of hardships that should not have been acceptable, had compelled her to see for herself what lay beyond the manicured grounds of her gilded cage. She took the small carriage without asking permission, for she had learned that Sebastian neither forbade her movements nor particularly attended to them, and the autumn morning was crisp and bright as she made her way down rutted lanes where the hedgerows grew wild and unpruned, where the prosperity of the great estate gave way by degrees to something far less comfortable. And by the time she reached Thornwick itself, Eleanor felt the familiar tightening in her chest that she remembered from childhood, from those years when her father's gambling had first begun to erode their own circumstances, and she had learned to recognize poverty not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality with a particular smell, a particular quality of silence. The cottages were not derelict, but they bore the unmistakable marks of careful neglect, of roofs patched rather than replaced, of gardens given over to vegetables because flowers were a luxury none could afford, and Eleanor walked among them with her fine cloak and her kid-leather gloves, and felt the weight of every gaze that followed her, curious and wary in equal measure. The Duke's mysterious bride come to observe their misery like some species of exotic bird. It was the child that broke through her observer's distance, a girl of perhaps 6, with hair the color of dirty straw and a cough that rattled in her chest like stones in a tin cup, and her mother, barely older than Eleanor herself, with hands red and raw from endless washing, explained that the fever had settled in her lungs 3 weeks past and would not shift, that the apothecary in the next town cost money they did not have, that she had tried every remedy she knew, but the child grew weaker each day, and Eleanor saw in the woman's eyes that particular species of terror known only to mothers watching their children slip away. She gave them everything. She had her household allowance for the month, the coins she kept for small purchases, even the pearl earrings she wore, her mother's earrings, because pearls could be sold and a child's life could not, and she returned to Ravenswood Hall with empty pockets and a heart full of something she could not name, only to find Sebastian waiting in the great hall, his expression unreadable as he demanded to know where she had been and what she had done with his money, and Eleanor faced him without apology or explanation beyond the simple truth. I gave it to a family whose child is dying because they cannot afford a physician, and I would do it again. Your Grace, because I can, and because someone should. The silence that followed stretched between them like a held breath, and she watched something flicker across his features, not anger, she realized with surprise, but something closer to bewilderment, as though she had spoken in a language he had long ago forgotten how to understand, and then he turned and walked away without a word, leaving her to wonder whether she had destroyed whatever fragile truce they had built, and it was not until a full week later that she learned the truth, that a physician had been installed in Thornwick with a salary paid by the estate, that medicine was being distributed to those who needed it, that the Duke of Ravenswood had done in days what generations of landlords had never thought to do, and Eleanor understood then that the coldness he wore was not absence of feeling but its opposite, that somewhere beneath the ice lay a heart that had simply forgotten it was allowed to beat. The attic revealed itself to Eleanor on a grey November afternoon, when she had wandered too far in her explorations of Ravenswood Hall's endless corridors, following a narrow staircase she had not previously noticed, its treads worn smooth by generations of feet that had climbed toward the forgotten spaces where great houses store their memories, and she emerged into a vast room beneath the eaves, where dust motes swirled in the weak light, filtering through dormer windows, and the accumulated possessions of centuries lay shrouded beneath white cloths like ghosts awaiting resurrection. And it was there, in a corner where the light fell just so, that she discovered the portrait, larger than she was tall, its gilded frame dulled by neglect, but its canvas protected by a heavy velvet draping that had preserved the colors beneath with remarkable fidelity, and when Eleanor drew back that covering, her breath caught in her throat as though she had been struck, for the young man who gazed back at her from the painted surface was Sebastian, and yet not Sebastian, a version of him she had never imagined could exist, perhaps 18 years old, his dark hair slightly disheveled, his severe features softened by something she had never seen on the face of her husband, a smile, genuine and unreserved, transforming him from merely handsome into something approaching radiant, and beside him stood a woman of extraordinary beauty, golden-haired and delicate as a porcelain figurine, her hand resting on his arm with the easy intimacy of absolute belonging, and Eleanor stood transfixed before this window into a past she had not known existed, this evidence of a Sebastian who had once known how to be happy, and she did not hear Missus. Thornton's approach until the housekeeper spoke softly from behind her. Lady Catherine Ashford, that was. God rest her soul. The story emerged in fragments, told in the housekeeper's quiet voice, while rain began to tap against the dormer windows like fingers seeking entry, and Eleanor learned of the great love that had transformed the young duke, of the courtship that had been the talk of 3 counties, of the wedding preparations that had consumed Ravenswood Hall with joy and anticipation, and then, 1 week before the ceremony that would have united 2 of England's finest families, the fever had come swift and merciless as a blade in the dark, and Lady Catherine had been gone within 3 days, and Sebastian had been away on business, had ridden through the night when the message reached him, had arrived only in time to see her coffin lowered into the earth, and something in him had been buried alongside her, something that had never climbed back into the light. He blamed himself. Mrs. Thornton continued, her weathered hands folded before her, her eyes fixed on the painted face of the woman who had died too young, said, if he'd been here, if he hadn't gone to London, somehow he could have saved her, though of course that's nonsense. Fever takes who it takes, and there's no bargaining with it. But guilt doesn't answer to reason, does it? Your Grace. And the master, well, he decided that if loving someone meant losing them so completely, he'd rather never love again, built walls around himself so high and so thick that no one could reach him, and after a while I think he forgot there was anything inside worth reaching for. Eleanor stood before the portrait long after Mrs. Thornton had retreated, studying the smile on Sebastian's young face, the way his painted eyes crinkled at the corners with unguarded joy, and she felt her heart breaking not for herself but for him, for the man who had learned to armor himself in ice because the alternative was to burn alive with grief, for the husband who held her at arm's length because he could not bear to hold anyone close. And she understood now that his coldness was not cruelty, but survival, not indifference, but the most desperate form of self-preservation, and she whispered to the empty attic, to the dust and the ghosts, and the preserved memory of a love that had ended in tragedy. I see you now, Sebastian Blackwood. I see all of you. And somewhere in the house below, in his study, where he sat alone with his ledgers and his silence, the Duke of Ravenswood felt an inexplicable shiver run down his spine, as though someone had spoken his name in a way it had not been spoken in 7 long and frozen years. The knowledge of Catherine's death settled into Eleanor like water into soil, changing the very composition of how she understood the man she had married, and in the days that followed her discovery in the attic, she found herself watching Sebastian with new eyes, not the wary assessment of a woman gauging her jailer, but the tender attention of someone who had glimpsed a wound and wished, against all wisdom, to help it heal, and she cultivated patience as carefully as she cultivated her garden, offering him small kindnesses without expectation, allowing silences to stretch without filling them with demands, believing that if she only gave him enough time, enough grace, the ice around his heart might begin to thaw of its own accord. But she had not accounted for the particular cruelty of a man at war with himself, had not understood that Sebastian could sense the shift in her regard, and that it terrified him far more than her earlier coldness ever had. The dinner began unremarkably enough, one of their increasingly frequent shared meals in the small dining room, where candlelight softened the Gothic severity of Ravenswood Hall, and Eleanor had been speaking of her plans for the spring garden, of the bulbs she intended to plant, and the roses that would need pruning, ordinary words about ordinary things, when Sebastian set down his wine-glass with a precision that should have warned her, and said, in a voice stripped of all warmth, "You have been different lately, madam, and I find I must address it before you embarrass us both with expectations I have no intention of fulfilling." And the words that followed were calculated to wound, delivered with the surgical precision of a man who had long ago learned exactly where to place a blade for maximum damage. He spoke of the debt, of her father's weakness, of the transaction that had brought her to his table, reminding her that proximity was not intimacy, and that whatever softness she imagined she perceived in him was merely the projection of a lonely woman desperate to find meaning in an arrangement that had none. And Eleanor sat very still as the assault washed over her, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed into an expression of such perfect calm that it cost her more than he would ever know. And when he had finished, when the silence rang with the echo of his cruelty, she rose from her chair with the dignity of a queen ascending a scaffold and said only, "You may hurt me with words, Your Grace, but I have survived worse than you. I have survived being sold by my own father, survived being brought to a house where I was promised nothing but cold tolerance, survived months of loneliness in a marriage that was never meant to be more than a cage, and I am still standing. So forgive me if your attempts to push me away do not send me running as you so clearly wish they would." And she walked from the room without looking back, climbed the stairs to her chamber with steady steps, and only when the door was closed behind her did she allow herself to sink onto the bed and press her hands against her eyes, refusing to cry for a man who did not want her tears. The clock struck 11, then midnight, and Eleanor lay in darkness listening to the house settle around her, and then she heard its footsteps in the corridor outside her door, heavy and deliberate, approaching and then stopping, and she held her breath as the silence stretched, as she imagined Sebastian standing just beyond the threshold, his hand perhaps raised to knock, his pride warring with something softer, something that had driven him to seek her out despite every word he had spoken at dinner. But the knock never came, only the sound of pacing, back and forth like a caged animal, and then finally retreating footsteps, and Eleanor understood that the battle being waged within him was far from over, that his cruelty at dinner had been the desperate action of a man who felt himself losing a war he had never intended to fight, and she whispered into the darkness, "I can wait. Sebastian Blackwood, I can wait longer than you know." The fever came as fevers do silently at first, a mere whisper of fatigue that Eleanor dismissed as the natural consequence of too many hours spent in her garden, despite the bitter November winds that had swept down from the moors, carrying with them the promise of the harsh winter to come, and she had ignored the ache in her bones, the strange lightness in her head, the way her hands trembled as she tucked the last of the bulbs into the frozen earth, telling herself that she had survived far worse than a chill, that her body would recover as it always had. But by evening she could no longer pretend, and when she failed to appear for dinner, Mrs. Thornton found her collapsed beside her bed, burning with a heat that seemed impossible for a human body to contain, her lips moving in fevered whispers that made no sense, and the household erupted into barely controlled chaos as servants rushed for cold water and clean linens, and someone rode for the physician through the darkening night. And it was into this pandemonium that Sebastian strode with a face so pale, so stricken, that Mrs. Thornton later swore she saw the ghost of the young man he had once been, the one who had ridden through the night 7 years ago only to arrive too late, the one who had watched another woman slip beyond his reach while he stood helpless and hollow, and he dismissed everyone with a single sharp command, his voice brooking no argument. And when the housekeeper protested that it was not proper, that the Duchess needed female attendance, he turned on her with eyes that blazed with something far more terrifying than his usual coldness. "I will not leave her, do you understand? I will not stand outside another door while someone—" And he stopped, the words catching in his throat. But Mrs. Thornton understood, and she left him there in the flickering candlelight with his dying wife, and Sebastian pulled a chair to Eleanor's bedside and took her burning hand in his, and began a vigil that would last 3 days and 3 nights, during which he did not sleep, did not eat, did not leave her side except to wring out cold cloths and press them to her forehead, to lift her when she thrashed and hold her when she wept. And in her delirium Eleanor called out for her mother, for the garden, for someone not to leave her alone, always alone, and Sebastian leaned close and whispered against her damp hair, "I'm here, Eleanor, I'm here, and I'm not leaving. Do you hear me? I'm not going anywhere, you stubborn, impossible woman. You cannot leave me now, not when I've only just—" And he couldn't finish, couldn't name the thing that had grown in him, despite every wall he'd built, but he held her hand through the fever's worst hours. Through the moments when her breathing grew so shallow, he pressed his ear to her chest, just to assure himself her heart still beat, and when the crisis finally broke on the 3rd night, when her fever ebbed like a tide retreating from the shore, and her breathing deepened into true sleep, Sebastian lowered his head to the edge of her bed and wept for the first time in 7 years, and Eleanor, swimming up from the depths of her illness, opened her eyes to grey morning light, and found him there, her cold, untouchable husband asleep in the chair beside her, his hand still wrapped around hers, his face haggard with exhaustion, and something else, something that looked remarkably like devotion, and she understood with the clarity that sometimes comes after nearly dying that everything between them had changed, that he had shown her something in those desperate hours that all his carefully constructed walls could never hide again, and she whispered his name, just Sebastian, nothing more. and watched him stir, watched his eyes open and find hers, watched the relief that flooded his features like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, and neither of them spoke of what had passed, but neither of them needed to, for some truths are too profound for words. The days of Eleanor's recovery passed in a strange, suspended world that seemed to exist outside the normal rhythms of Ravenswood Hall, a cocoon of quiet moments and careful attention that would have seemed impossible mere weeks before. And Sebastian, her cold, distant husband who had sworn he wanted nothing from her but her presence, became a man she barely recognized, appearing at her door each morning with books he thought she might enjoy, sitting in the chair beside her window while she rested, reading aloud in his deep voice until the words blurred together into a comforting river of sound. And when she was strong enough to sit up, he brought her tea himself rather than summoning servants, arranging the pillows behind her back with hands that trembled slightly, as though he feared she might shatter if handled without the utmost care, and Eleanor watched this transformation with wonder and wariness in equal measure, wondering if the fever had damaged her mind, and she was imagining this attentive ghost who wore her husband's face. But the warmth of his presence was real, the low rumble of his voice as he debated with her about the merits of various poets was real, and she found herself hoarding these moments like precious gems, uncertain how long they would last before he remembered himself and retreated behind his walls once more. But the walls did not return, or rather, they remained, but with doors now, doors that he seemed willing if not quite able to open, and one evening as the fire burned low and shadows gathered in the corners of her chamber, Eleanor gathered her courage and spoke the name that had haunted her since the attic. "Tell me about Catherine." And Sebastian went very still, his hand frozen in the act of turning a page, and the silence stretched so long that Eleanor thought she had shattered something irreparable. But then he closed the book and set it aside and stared into the fire, and when he spoke his voice was rough with disuse, as though these words had been locked away so long they had grown rusty. "She was sunlight, Catherine was, all golden hair and laughter, and I was so young, so foolish, so certain that the world would give me everything I wanted because I had never known it to do. Otherwise I was called away on business. Just a week before the wedding, my father's affairs were in disarray, and I thought, there is time, there is always time. And I left her," and his voice cracked on the word, "I left her. And 3 days later the fever came, and I rode through the night, but she was gone before I arrived, gone without me there to hold her hand, without me there to say goodbye, and the last thing I ever said to her was, 'I'll return before you can miss me,' as though I had any right to make such promises, as though I had any power over death." And Eleanor's heart broke for him, for the young man who had carried this guilt like chains for 7 years, and she reached out and took his hand, not caring about propriety, not caring about the careful distance they had maintained, and he looked at their joined fingers as though he couldn't quite believe she was touching him, and she asked softly, "Is that why you built your walls so high? Because you believed that if you never let yourself love again, you could never lose again?" And he nodded, a single jerky movement, and whispered, "I swore I would never feel that way again. It was easier to feel nothing, to want nothing, to be nothing but a cold and empty hall." And Eleanor tightened her grip on his hand and asked the question that had been building in her chest since she woke to find him at her bedside. "And now?" And Sebastian finally lifted his eyes to meet hers, and in their grey depths she saw not ice, but something molten, something barely contained, and he said in a voice like a man confessing his sins, "Now I find that impossible." Winter descended upon Ravenswood Hall with a fury that transformed the world into a landscape of crystalline silence, snow burying the gardens Eleanor had so lovingly tended, frost etching elaborate patterns across every window pane, and yet within those ancient stone walls something remarkable was occurring, a thaw that defied the season, a warmth that grew in inverse proportion to the bitter cold outside. For Sebastian and Eleanor had begun to exist not as strangers sharing a roof, but as two people cautiously, wonderingly, discovering each other anew, and their evenings now found them in the library before the roaring fire. She curled in her chair with a book while he sat across from her, pretending to review estate documents, though his eyes wandered to her face far more often than they touched the papers, and they talked of everything and nothing of the books they loved and the philosophies they pondered, of her mother's garden and his childhood adventures in these very halls before grief had hollowed them out. And sometimes they simply sat in companionable silence, which was its own form of intimacy, this ability to share space without the need to fill it with words. And one December evening, when the snow fell so thick and fast that it seemed the world beyond these walls had ceased to exist entirely, Sebastian rose from his chair and extended his hand to Eleanor with an expression she had never seen him wear, nervous, almost shy, and said, "There is something I should like to show you, if you are willing." And she took his hand without hesitation, marveling at the warmth of his fingers wrapped around hers, and he led her through corridors she had never traversed to the east wing she had wondered about since her first days at Ravenswood. And when he produced a key and unlocked the door that had been sealed for 7 years, she understood the magnitude of what he was offering her, not just access to rooms, but access to the most protected chambers of his heart. And they walked together through spaces frozen in time, furniture draped in white cloths like ghosts, until they reached a sitting room where a portrait hung above the mantel, and there was Catherine, golden and luminous, captured in oils at the height of her youth, and Sebastian stood before it with Eleanor's hand still in his, and said quietly, "She would have liked you. I think she had that same quality, that same refusal to be diminished by circumstance." And Eleanor heard not grief in his voice, but something gentler, acceptance perhaps, or the beginnings of peace, and she squeezed his hand and replied, "Thank you for showing me," understanding that this was his way of saying she had become important enough to meet the ghost he had carried so long. And later that night, as they parted in the corridor outside her chambers, Sebastian lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, the first intentional touch of affection he had ever offered. And Eleanor felt her heart stutter and soar, and she realized with a clarity that stole her breath that she had fallen in love with this complicated, wounded, slowly healing man, though doubt whispered in the quiet hours that followed. Did he see her truly, Eleanor herself, or merely a remedy for his loneliness, a living presence to fill the emptiness Catherine had left? And this question haunted her, even as her heart swelled with feelings she could no longer deny, because she knew she could survive many things, but she was not certain she could survive being loved as a substitute rather than a choice. The announcement came like a thunderclap through the quiet counties surrounding Ravenswood. The Duke of Ravenswood would host a winter ball, the first social gathering within those imposing walls in 7 long years, and society, that ravenous beast ever hungry for scandal and spectacle, descended upon the news with barely concealed glee, for here was entertainment beyond measure. The cold Duke, who had retreated from the world after his betrothed's death, the mysterious bride acquired through rumors of debt and desperation, and now this inexplicable emergence from isolation that set every drawing room from here to London ablaze with speculation. Eleanor learned of the ball not from Sebastian himself, but from Mrs. Thornton, who delivered the news with tears glistening in her eyes and joy trembling in her voice, saying, "He's coming back to life, Your Grace. After all these years, he's finally coming back to life." And Eleanor felt her heart constrict with a mixture of hope and terror, for she understood what this gesture meant, even as she dreaded what it would require of her, to stand before the judgment of people who had whispered about her origins, who knew the circumstances of her marriage, who would examine her like a curiosity purchased at auction and found wanting the preparations consumed Ravenswood Hall for weeks, servants polishing silver that hadn't seen candlelight in years, gardeners forcing hothouse flowers to bloom despite the snow, and Sebastian himself overseeing every detail, with an intensity that surprised Eleanor until she realized this was his way of proving something, though whether to society or to her or to himself, she could not say. The night of the ball arrived wrapped in frost and starlight, and Eleanor stood before her mirror in a gown of midnight blue silk that Sebastian had commissioned from London's finest modiste, sapphires at her throat that had belonged to 3 generations of Ravenswood duchesses, and she barely recognized the elegant creature staring back at her, this woman who had once knelt in the dirt of a dying garden with nothing to her name but determination and heartbreak. The guests arrived in a glittering stream of carriages, and Eleanor descended the grand staircase to find the ballroom transformed into a winter wonderland of candles and crystal, music swelling from the orchestra Sebastian had engaged, and everywhere, the curious eyes and whispered conversations that followed her like shadows. "That's her, the Ashworth girl," she heard, and "a debt payment, dressed in silk. Nothing more," and "the Duke must have lost his mind to parade her so publicly," and each word was a small knife sliding between her ribs until she found herself retreating to an alcove behind a pillar of white roses, fighting to control her breathing, fighting the urge to flee back to her chambers and never emerge. But then Sebastian was there, materializing from the crowd, as though he had sensed her distress across the room, and his grey eyes swept over her face with an intensity that made her breath catch, and without a word, he extended his hand and said in a voice that carried across the sudden hush that had fallen over the assembly, "Dance with me." Eleanor, using her Christian name for the first time in public, a declaration more intimate than any kiss, and as he led her onto the floor and the orchestra struck up a waltz, she felt the weight of every gaze in the room, but found she could not look away from his face, and Sebastian held her as though she were precious, as though she were the only person in that glittering hall, and when she whispered, "They're all watching," he replied without breaking his gaze, "Let them talk, I see only you." And in that moment Eleanor understood that whatever doubts had plagued her, whatever fears had whispered that she was merely a remedy for his loneliness, this man was choosing her before the eyes of everyone who mattered, declaring with actions what he had not yet found words to say, and she let herself be swept away in his arms, while the candles blazed, and the music soared, and the whispers faded into insignificance against the thundering of her own heart. The morning after the ball dawned grey and hushed, snow still falling in lazy spirals past Eleanor's window, and she found herself unable to settle, unable to quiet the restless joy that hummed beneath her skin, for something had shifted between her and Sebastian in that glittering ballroom, something that felt like a promise even if no words had been spoken, and it was this restlessness that drove her to wander the halls of Ravenswood while Sebastian attended to correspondence in his study, her feet carrying her through familiar passages until she found herself standing before the door of his private office. Not the formal study where he received guests, but the smaller room where he conducted his true business, and she meant only to leave a note, a small thank you for the sapphires she still wore, but when she entered she found the room empty, Sebastian having stepped out momentarily, and her eyes fell upon the desk, where documents lay scattered in uncharacteristic disarray, and she would not have looked, would not have violated his privacy so, except that her own name caught her attention, Eleanor Ashworth, written in a solicitor's careful hand on a document dated nearly a year before her marriage, and her fingers trembled as she lifted the paper and began to read, her heart first stuttering, then stopping entirely, as the truth unfolded before her in black ink and legal language, a complete discharge of Lord Ashworth's debts, paid in full by Sebastian Blackwood, Duke of Ravenswood, dated 3 months before any proposal had been made, 3 months before the black carriage had arrived at her crumbling estate. With its devastating terms, she rifled through more papers with hands that shook, finding correspondence between Sebastian and her father, finding drafts of the marriage proposal, finding most damning of all, a letter in Sebastian's own hand that spoke of a garden party, 2 summers past, of a woman in a faded dress who had knelt in the dirt to save a trampled rose, of how he had watched her from across the lawn and felt something crack open in his chest that he had thought dead forever, of how he had spent months learning everything about her, only to discover that her father's debts gave him an excuse, a reason to reach for her that didn't require him to risk the rejection he was certain would come. If he simply asked, Eleanor heard the door open behind her, heard Sebastian's sharp intake of breath as he saw what she held, and when she turned to face him, her eyes were bright with tears and something more complicated than anger, and she whispered, "There was no debt when you proposed. You had already paid it, the arrangement, the coercion, my father's shame. All of it was," and Sebastian stood frozen in the doorway, every wall he had ever built, crumbling to dust in the face of her discovery. And when he spoke, his voice was raw and broken in a way she had never heard. "I didn't think someone like you could ever want someone like me, a cold, broken, hollow man with nothing to offer but money and a reputation for cruelty. The arrangement gave me a reason. Don't you see? It gave me a way to have you near me without having to confess that I had loved you from the moment I saw you kneel in that garden and show more tenderness to a damaged flower than anyone had shown me in 7 years. And I know it was wrong. I know I built our marriage on a lie. But Eleanor," and his voice cracked on her name as he crossed the room and fell to his knees before her, this proud duke brought low by the weight of his deception and his desperate, terrified love, "I would do it again. God help me, because any path that led to you was a path I would walk, even one paved with my own cowardice." She ran not from him, not truly, but from the shattering of every assumption that had structured her existence within these walls, from the dizzying vertigo of discovering that the cage she had resigned herself to had never had bars at all, that she had been free this entire time and simply hadn't known it. And her feet carried her through the servants' corridors and out to the stables where she saddled her mare with trembling hands, ignoring the groom's protests about the weather, about the fresh snow that had been falling since dawn, about the temperature that bit through her cloak. Like teeth, she needed air, needed distance, needed to outrun the storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her, and so she rode out into the white wilderness of the Ravenswood grounds, her mare's hooves muffled by the deepening drifts, the world reduced to swirling white and the grey shadows of bare trees. And she did not know how long she rode, or how far, only that at some point her horse stumbled on hidden ice beneath the snow, and Eleanor was thrown, landing hard enough to drive the breath from her lungs. And when she rose, her mare had bolted, and she was alone in a landscape that had become featureless and alien, the snow falling so thick now that she could not see 10 feet in any direction. Panic seized her throat before training took over, before the practical voice of survival that had guided her through poverty and shame, and a marriage built on lies, reminded her that she had seen an old structure nearby, a groundskeeper's cottage abandoned years ago, and she stumbled toward where she thought it stood, until finally, blessedly, her frozen hands found rough stone walls and a door that yielded to her. Desperate pushing, the cottage was barely warmer than outside, stripped of furnishings, save for a broken chair and a fireplace that still held old kindling, and Eleanor's numb fingers struck flint, until finally, miraculously, flames caught and began to cast their wavering light across the small room. And there she huddled as the storm howled outside, and the hours crept past and the light faded from grey to black, and she had begun to wonder if this was how she would end, frozen in a forgotten cottage, because she couldn't bear to face a truth that was actually beautiful. If she could only let herself believe it, when the door burst open in a shower of snow, and there stood Sebastian, wild-eyed and frost-rimed, his horse's reins clutched in one white-knuckled hand, and the sound that escaped him when he saw her alive was something between a sob and a prayer, as he crossed the small space and pulled her into his arms with a desperation that shattered her last defenses. "I thought I'd lost you," he gasped against her hair, his whole body shaking. "I thought God was punishing me for my deception by taking you, and I knew I would deserve it. I knew." And Eleanor found herself clinging to him with equal ferocity, her anger melting into something more complex and more honest. And when at last they drew apart enough to speak, both kneeling on the frozen dirt floor of that abandoned cottage, with the fire crackling and the storm sealing them away from the world, the words came without calculation or defense. "I was a coward," Sebastian confessed, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that burned. "I've been a coward since Catherine died, hiding behind walls and distance and coldness, because feeling nothing seemed safer than risking that pain again. And when I saw you in that garden, I wanted you so desperately, and I was so certain you could never want me, that I built an elaborate prison and told myself I was giving you no choice so that I wouldn't have to face the terror of offering you one." And Eleanor reached up to touch his face with fingers still numb from cold, and her own truth spilled forth. "And I was so busy surviving, so focused on enduring whatever life demanded of me, that I forgot to actually live. I accepted the cage you offered because fighting for something better felt like a luxury I hadn't earned. And I think," her voice cracked, "I think I was afraid too, afraid that if I let myself want more, I would only be disappointed. And it was easier to expect nothing than to hope." And in the flickering firelight, stripped of everything but honesty, Sebastian leaned forward and kissed her, not a gentle kiss, not tentative, but desperate and tender and real. Months of longing and fear and gradual love pouring through the press of his lips against hers, and Eleanor kissed him back with equal abandon, her cold fingers tangling in his snow-damp hair. And outside the storm raged on, but within that small forgotten cottage something new was being born, something that had nothing to do with debts or arrangements or the lies they had told themselves, something that was simply and terrifyingly and magnificently true. They rode back to Ravenswood through the pale dawn, the storm having exhausted itself sometime in the small hours while they lay tangled together before the dying fire, not in passion but in something more profound, a holding on, a refusal to let distance creep between them ever again. and as the great house rose before them against the pink-stained sky, Eleanor felt as though she was seeing it for the first time, not as a prison or a gilded cage, but as what it might become. A home, if they were brave enough to make it one, and Sebastian must have sensed the shift in her thoughts, because he reached across the space between their horses and caught her hand, his grip firm despite the cold that had numbed them both. And when they entered the hall to find the servants gathered in anxious clusters, Mrs. Thornton weeping with relief, and the footmen pretending they hadn't been preparing search parties, Sebastian did not retreat into his familiar coldness, but instead kept Eleanor's hand in his and announced simply, "The Duchess and I require hot baths, warm food, and privacy. We have much to discuss." And if the staff found this behavior remarkable from a man who had barely acknowledged his wife's existence for months, they were too well trained to show it, though Eleanor caught the look that passed between Mrs. Thornton and the butler, a look of tremulous hope that made her heart ache for all the people who had watched Sebastian suffer in silence for so long later. After they had thawed and eaten and changed into dry clothes, Sebastian came to her sitting room and stood before her with an uncertainty she had never seen in him. This man who commanded rooms and businesses and the fear of half of London's society. And he said, "I want to court you properly, honestly, without the shadow of deception between us. I know we are already married. I know you might think it foolish. But we began wrong, Eleanor. We began with lies and arrangements and walls. And I want," he faltered, and she saw the effort it cost him to continue. "I want to earn you, the way I should have tried to do from the beginning, if I hadn't been so bloody terrified of wanting something this much." And Eleanor rose from her chair and crossed to him and placed her hands on either side of his face, forcing him to meet her eyes, and she said, "Yes, but on one condition. No more walls, Sebastian. Not between us. Not ever again. I will not live with your ghost. I want the man, all of him, even the parts that are broken and afraid." And the smile that broke across his face was like watching ice crack on a frozen river. The first rush of spring after an endless winter, and in the weeks that followed, Ravenswood Hall transformed around them, as Sebastian kept his word. He brought her flowers from the hothouse each morning, sat with her at every meal, walked with her through the snowy grounds while telling her stories of his childhood, his mother, even Catherine, sharing the memories instead of hoarding them like wounds. The servants whispered that they had heard the Duke actually laugh, and one of the kitchen maids swore she had seen him smile at the Duchess across the breakfast table in a way that made her believe in love again. And when the snow finally began to melt and the first brave shoots of green appeared in Eleanor's garden, she planted new bulbs with Sebastian kneeling beside her in the mud, his fine clothes ruined and his expression one of perfect contentment. Roses for Catherine, because she deserved to be remembered with beauty rather than grief. Forget-me-nots for Eleanor's mother, whose love of gardens had been passed down like an inheritance more precious than gold. And something new, something that had never grown at Ravenswood before, a bed of white jasmine for the future they would build together, for the nights yet to come when its fragrance would drift through open windows and remind them that even the coldest seasons eventually yield to spring. Spring arrived at Ravenswood like a benediction, like forgiveness made manifest in tender green shoots and birdsong, and the sweet, persistent fragrance of Eleanor's gardens, finally bursting into the full glory she had envisioned during those long winter months of planning and planting and hope. The roses she had planted for Catherine bloomed, in shades of cream and blush, their petals soft as memory, while the forget-me-nots spread in rivers of blue beneath the old apple trees where Eleanor's mother might have loved to sit, and the jasmine was already beginning to climb the garden walls, promising summer nights filled with perfume and possibility. And it was in this garden, on a morning when the light seemed spun from gold and the air hummed with bees drunk on nectar, that Sebastian found Eleanor with her hands in the soil and her hair escaping its pins and dirt smudged across her cheek. And he thought he had never seen anything more beautiful in his entire life, this woman who had transformed not just his grounds but his very soul. And he knelt beside her in the damp earth without care for his fine trousers and said, "I have something for you." And when Eleanor looked up, brushing hair from her eyes with the back of her wrist, she saw that he held a small velvet box, and her heart stuttered because she recognized the gesture, even as confusion flickered across her features. "We are already married," she said softly, and Sebastian smiled. that smile that still felt like a miracle every time she witnessed it, and replied, "We are, but you deserved better than that cold ceremony in that grey chapel, where I couldn't even bring myself to look at you because I was so terrified of what I might feel. You deserved a man who chose you freely and openly, and without deception, and I cannot change how we began, but I can change what we become." And he opened the box to reveal a ring unlike anything Eleanor had expected. Not the heavy Ravenswood heirloom with its ancient diamonds that she had worn since their wedding day, but something new, something delicate, a band of gold set with a single sapphire, the exact color of her eyes, surrounded by tiny diamonds like stars around a midnight sky. "I designed it myself," Sebastian admitted, and there was vulnerability in his voice, the echo of the frightened man who still lived beneath the Duke's polished surface. "I wanted you to have something that was only yours, only ours, that carried no history except the history we make together. Eleanor, you are not a replacement for what I lost. You are not a remedy for loneliness or a solution to grief. You are my choice, freely and completely and with my whole heart. And I choose you today, and I will choose you tomorrow, and every day until I draw my last breath." And Eleanor's eyes filled with tears that spilled down her cheeks, and she didn't care, didn't try to hide them, because these were tears of joy, of completion, of a heart so full it could not contain itself. And she cupped his face in her soil-stained hands and said, "And you are mine, all of you, Sebastian, the coldness and the warmth, the fear and the courage, the broken parts and the parts still healing. I love you not despite your wounds, but because of who they have made you, and I am honored to be your choice." And when he slipped the ring onto her finger, it felt like a promise more sacred than their first vows had been. And that afternoon they stood together in the garden, surrounded by blooming roses and faithful forget-me-nots, and the tender green promise of jasmine, and before the witnesses of the household staff who had watched their long, strange journey from strangers to lovers, they renewed their vows, not the formal words of the church, but promises they had written themselves. Promises about patience and honesty, and choosing each other, even when choosing was hard, about building a home where grief could be honored and joy could flourish, about loving not perfectly but persistently. And when the simple ceremony ended, Sebastian kissed his wife with a tenderness that made Mrs. Thornton weep into her handkerchief, and that night as they lay tangled together in the moonlight that streamed through the windows of the master bedroom they now shared, Sebastian pressed his lips to Eleanor's hair and whispered her name, just Eleanor. Nothing more, no titles or formality, just her name, spoken like a prayer, like a promise, like the most sacred word he knew, and she turned in his arms and kissed him and felt, for the first time in her life, completely and utterly home. 3 years had passed since that spring of renewal, 3 years of seasons turning and gardens growing and love deepening like roots reaching ever further into rich soil, and Ravenswood Hall had transformed so completely that visitors who remembered its former austere grandeur could scarcely believe they had come to the same estate. Sunlight poured through windows that had once been shrouded in heavy drapes. Laughter echoed through corridors that had known only silence, and everywhere there were flowers, cut blooms in crystal vases, potted plants on windowsills, the very walls seeming to breathe with life and warmth. And on this particular afternoon in late summer, Eleanor knelt in her garden with her hands in the familiar soil. But she was not alone, for beside her crouched a small figure with Sebastian's dark hair and Eleanor's blue eyes, a daughter they had named Rose for the flowers that had first brought them together, and for the woman whose memory Sebastian could now hold with gratitude rather than grief. And little Rose, not yet 2 years old, was attempting with great seriousness to plant a seed in the manner her mother had shown her, her chubby fingers patting the earth with more enthusiasm than precision, while Eleanor guided her gently, patiently, the way she had once coaxed beauty from the neglected grounds of this very estate. The sound of footsteps on the gravel path made them both look up, and there was Sebastian, striding toward them with his coat discarded and his sleeves rolled to his elbows, and a smile on his face that still made Eleanor's heart catch, even after all this time. And Rose scrambled to her feet with a shriek of delight, running to her father on unsteady legs, and Sebastian swept her up and swung her high while she giggled with abandon, and Eleanor watched them with tears pricking her eyes because she remembered the man who had stood before her in that cold chapel, the man who could not even look at her, the man so frozen with fear and grief that he had forgotten what joy felt like, and she marveled at the miracle of transformation. Later that day, a carriage arrived bearing an unexpected visitor, Lord Ashworth, Eleanor's father, sober now for nearly 2 years, and aged in ways that spoke of hard-won battles against his demons, and Eleanor received him in the garden where she had found her salvation, and their conversation was tentative at first, weighted with years of hurt and disappointment. But when he asked her forgiveness, with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, she found that she could give it, not because the wounds had vanished, but because she had learned that holding on to pain only poisoned the one who carried it. And Sebastian stood at a distance watching this reconciliation with something like peace in his eyes, this man who understood about fathers and failures and the complicated arithmetic of forgiveness that evening. After Rose had been tucked into her nursery and the house had settled into its quiet nighttime rhythms, Sebastian and Eleanor walked to the terrace where they had stood so many times before, watching the sun sink below the horizon in a blaze of amber and rose, and Sebastian drew Eleanor close against his side and pressed a kiss to her hair and said nothing, because some moments required no words, only presence, only the profound gift of standing beside someone who had seen your darkness and chosen to stay. And as the first stars appeared in the velvet sky, Eleanor thought of all the paths that had led them here, the debts and deceptions, the walls and wounds, the storms and silences, and she understood that every step had been necessary, that the bitter had made the sweet more precious, that their love had been forged in difficulty and was stronger for it. Dear listener, perhaps you have journeyed with us through this tale of ice and thaw, of hearts that feared to hope and learned to love anyway, and perhaps you recognize something of yourself in Eleanor's quiet endurance or Sebastian's frozen grief. For we all carry our wounds differently, but we carry them nonetheless. We all build walls when the world proves too painful. We all forget sometimes that protection and prison can wear the same face. But here is what Eleanor and Sebastian discovered in that cold cottage with snow falling outside and pretense finally stripped away. The coldest hearts often burn brightest once they remember how. And patience is not passive waiting, but active hope, and the people who seem most unreachable are sometimes simply waiting for someone brave enough to reach. So if there is someone in your life whose walls seem insurmountable, someone whose coldness makes you wonder if warmth exists beneath, consider this. You may be looking at fear wearing the mask of indifference, grief dressed as cruelty, loneliness pretending to be strength, and if you yourself are the one behind the walls, if you are the one who has sworn never to feel again because feeling once cost too much, then hear this. It is not too late. It is never too late. Spring always follows winter, and gardens can grow from the most neglected ground. May you find the courage to reach across the distance. May you find someone who sees past your walls to the tender heart within. May you plant seeds of hope even when the soil seems barren, and may you rest tonight knowing that love, patient and persistent and brave, is still the most transformative force in all the world.